this program is made possible thanks to a very generous donor, Muhtar Kent, the retired chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola, who has noted in his career that the world, and that's something I noted too from my own vantage point as the former head of peacekeeping and then crisis group, is that the world of diplomacy, the world of business, the world of civil society don't always easily interact with each other. And yet it's common sense to accept that if you want to address conflict in our world, you need a joint effort. And it's hard enough to address conflict in isolation. You really need to bring together the various players. And that's what we're trying to do in this program. Not only that, but we'll be looking at the transformation of conflict, and the transformation of conflict implies the transformation of conflict resolution. And of course, this panel, this training week happens at a time of great uncertainties in the world. And one of the issues we will look at is how the world sees those uncertainties. There will be a panel on regional perspectives that I will moderate later in the week on Thursday. And I think it'd be interesting to see how you look at the world with different lenses. If you are in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, and whether there can be a common agenda, still a shared agenda. And it's far from obvious, but it's part of our efforts.
My name's Jake Sherman. I'm Minister Counselor for UN Management and Reform at the U.S. Mission to the UN downtown. Some of you are familiar to me from that role. I thought I'd start quickly by introducing our speakers. I'll start with the two on screen, and hopefully Pekka will join us soon. So first we have Daojiong, who's Professor of International Economy. Oh, he's on, great. At Peking University at the School of International Studies. We're also joined by Ghassan Salamé, who's the founding dean of the Paris School of International Affairs and the former special representative of the Secretary General for the UN Support Mission in Libya, UNSMIL, as well as Pekka Haavisto, who is currently the Foreign Minister of Finland. So just in terms of format, I'm going to ask each panelist a tailored question, and each of the other panelists will have the opportunity to respond, and then a follow-up question. Unfortunately, I think as many of you know, we had hoped to be joined by a fourth panelist today, Bintu Keita, who's the special representative of the Secretary General in the Democratic Republic of Congo and head of MONUSCO. And since she was not, but the panelists are aware of the question, and I think it brings out some important dynamics on the theme of mapping the landscape of 20th century conflict. We'll ask the panelists that question as well, and then have plenty of time for all of you. So I'm going to start actually with Pekka, if I may. And I want to start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think is on many of our minds these days. Many European commentators have described the invasion as Europe's 9/11, as Europe's September 11th. What does Russia's naked use of hard power, including attacks on civilians, nuclear saber rattling, and disinformation throughout the invasion, mean not only for European security, but for international order? Pekka, please.
Thank you, and best greetings from Helsinki. I hope that you can hear me and see me. First of all, thanks for this opportunity of taking part, and good to see you, Jean-Marie, and your colleague online there. First, maybe my first remark actually on European situation is people are asking why didn't we react 2008 when there was the invasion of Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. why didn't we react so strongly 2014 when the attack and occupation of Crimea happened? And my answer to that is that we have seen so far a Russia that has somehow been calculating the risks in its military attacks and invasion. But now we see actually Russia that is ready to take higher risks, and this is what has changed. And as we can see, Russia is ready to take more losses to its own military and material and so forth. And it's really time to analyze to what this will lead. My second remark is actually the European security architecture. For us in Finland, the OEC and everything, the Helsinki Final Act that was created 1975, almost 50 years ago, has always been there to prevent warfare in Europe. And now we are unfortunately in a situation where this European security architecture didn't function or didn't bring the results. We are in a war in Europe, and we have this big question: how do we make peace in circumstances where the security architecture is broken? We also see a Russia that is ready to concentrate 100,000 troops without a general mobilization in one spot on its border. And of course, this means that we all who are living next to Russia are a little bit concerned what could happen next and so forth. And then my two last remarks: we see this kind of loose talk about unconventional weapons, including chemical weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. This is something that we have not been so used in Europe. I think maybe the Cuban crisis was the last moment when seriously this type of weapon types were discussed, and we are facing that. And then finally, we see, as you mentioned, we see a warfare where rules of warfare are not respected. If you look at the 5 Geneva Conventions and the rules of the warfare, protecting civilians, how to deal with the prisoners or prisoners of war and so forth, we see grave violations of all these rules. And all this is putting us in front of analyzing the situation from the totally new basis. And in that sense, maybe the 9/11 reflection or idea is there, because we are probably dealing with the new Russia. And this, of course, leads to the debate in Europe that can we make a peace, or should there happen regime change? And we who live next to Russia know from 100-year perspective that regime changes can either repeat the current leadership or go from bad to worse, or go to more liberal and democratic direction. And this is something that we cannot maybe from outside of Russia steer. Back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Pekka. And I'll turn to the other two panelists for their reactions, both to Pekka's answer and also to the question itself. So maybe Ghassan, starting with you, I mean, what's your sense of the wider implications of Russia's invasion, both for European security and for the international order, particularly given, as Pekka said, we're seeing routine violations of accepted norms and rules of warfare?
I think we are we have been witnessing for a while deregulation of international politics, the way we had a deregulation of economics, of politics through populism, or even of information through the information technology, new information technology. This is a deregulation of norms. Basically, a number of norms and concepts in international law have been violated. The original sin is probably the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was not authorized by the Security Council and which was opposed by important countries, including a few P5 countries such as Russia, China, or France, or even Germany. But since then, we have seen many cases where this deregulation of force has been the case. And you mentioned Georgia or Ukraine in 2014, and these were cases where this deregulation was at play. So a lot of people think this is a change in the paradigm. I don't like at all the mention of 9/11, to be honest, because I believe that 9/11 is a horrible terrorist attack. This is something very different from an interstate war like the one we are witnessing now. We are witnessing a classical international war. That is why I don't see a new paradigm at play. What I see is a rejuvenation of the old realist paradigm, where interstate wars, which we believed were disappearing from our sort of screen, are coming back. We had one between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Before that, we had one between Ethiopia and Eritrea, but interstate wars were becoming very rare. And now they are back. So it's a rejuvenation of the realist model, and a contradiction to non-state actor activities such as the terrorist attack on 9/11. The second part of this rejuvenation is the value of territory and conquest. I have an essay by Anna Simons before my eyes called The End of Conquest, because territories are not important anymore, because wealth, power, influence do come from other sources than territory. Still, you are having a number of territorial conflicts unresolved across the world, and Ukraine promises to be one of the worst. 3, we have been used to the fact that the world is divided into 2. One part was at peace, mainly Europe, North America, and some other places. And another one, Africa, Central America, and the Middle East, etc., were still in the war age. What we are seeing now is that war can also erupt in the so-called pacified continent that is Europe. 4, and it was mentioned by Mr. Haavisto, the nuclear part. Of course, there had been incidents on the border between China and India and Pakistan, and all of the 3 are nuclear powers. There has been a war in 1973 between Israel and Arab countries, while the Arab leaders knew that Israel had become, although in non-avoid, but still had become a nuclear state. What's new here, and I think Mr. Haavisto was right in mentioning Cuba, is that the nuclear thing is put on the table. The nuclear, it's not a threat, but the mentioning of the nuclear capabilities is explicitly put on the table, which was not the case in the conflicts I have mentioned. Finally, I think it's a rejuvenation of the realistic paradigm, because basically what we have been hearing in the past 30 years was that more economic interdependence will help ending the war. Of course, the interdependence between Russia and the West and NATO countries is now much, much, much wider, or has been wider until 2 months ago, 3 months ago, than it was during the Cold War. But it did not prevent the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. All this leads me to say we are not witnessing a new paradigm, but we are witnessing a rejuvenation and updating of the realist one.
Great, thanks so much, Ghassan. So not a new paradigm, but a reinvigoration of the old realist paradigm. Daojiong, let me turn to you and see if you agree, or if you have other comments that you want to add from where you sit in the world.
Well, I don't know whether it was by coincidence or by design. Both the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict and this time Russia-Ukraine conflict coincided with China hosting Olympics and the Russian delegations, high-level delegation visiting Beijing. Of course, the big difference was that 2008, when the conflict took place, everybody just shrugged it off. And this time, the response was a surprise to most of us. And then secondly, after I heard Mr. Foreign Minister of Finland, his remarks, especially toward the end, I have a good deal of empathy because if anything here in China, we were, the country was on the receiving end of military actions in recent history and recent memories. You talk about Imperial Japan, or even had conflict with occupation by Tsarist Russia. So it's a delicate situation in terms of how China should be positioning itself. I don't speak Russian, and I'm not an expert on European affairs. So I'm not going to be commenting on the details as to the causality. But is this a new paradigm? This has to answer to that sort of question needs to be empirically based in terms of history. But it does come across to me, I study energy conflicts as a geopolitical factor, energy as a manifestation of geopolitics more closely. It does seem to me this is more of a conventional conflict between neighbors, and neighbors have different packages of history, but for better or for worse, here in Asia, in this part of Asia, there is a salient recognition that the Vietnam War taught us an important lesson. And that lesson for all countries in the region is that no matter what, you have neighbors who won't move away, and you cannot escape from them. And the last thing one entity should be doing in terms of relating to its neighbor is to drag in an outside actor militarily and justify that on ideological grounds. I don't know if my English is good enough. That's what we learned from No More Vietnam. Meaning, if you look at what happened to Vietnam on that land, either the collateral damage or whatnot, even in Laos and Cambodia, it's that somehow Asia in the 50s and 60s elevated ideological confrontation to the battlefield. And we should not be repeating that here in this part of the world. That's in many ways what we call the so-called Asian way of handling conflict. Let me stop here and we can probably move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Daojiong. 2 points that several of you mentioned. This idea that at least in recent history, the idea that much of let's say, the West has proceeded past the point of conflict while much of the rest of the world remains affected by it, and that Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually, part of the reason it's been such a shock to the West is that it undermines this idea. And Daojiong, as you said, that this isn't really a paradigm shift, but rather a conventional conflict between neighbors. Ghassan, I want to turn to you and ask whether or not you see a double standard when it comes to the response of what we generally refer to as the international community, particularly, for example, as embodied by the Security Council or the tremendous flows of aid, including weapons, major shifts in the foreign policy of many countries in Europe, including your own, when we think about the application for NATO membership. Is there, Ghassan, a double standard by the international community to threats faced by other countries in other parts of the world?
Well, how I see it, was it to me, the question?
The question is, when you look at the response of Europe,
I think you said Ghassan and you meant Pekka.
No, I mean Ghassan.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
Sorry, Pekka. Yeah.
Because then
And then I'll go around. Each of you will have the opportunity to respond, but
Okay.
I'm going to start with Ghassan.
Okay. Look, double standards, certainly. Am I surprised? Absolutely not. Double standards is the daily life of international politics. Nobody is really committed to a moral behavior to treat everybody likewise. This is not part of international politics. So yes, the refugees from Ukraine were treated better than the refugees from Syria. So yes, NATO was much more mobilized for Ukraine than it had been for Georgia. Of course, that's evident. But there is nothing surprising here. What is problematic and remains problematic and will be even more problematic in the years to come is that you need a place where a minimum of collective security is somehow negotiated and decided. That place is called the Security Council. If the Security Council is divided the way it is, there is no alternative for the time being. There is no concert, informal concert of nations. The G7, the G20, etc., do not make up for the fact that the Security Council is not providing a minimum of collective security to the whole planet. And the reason is clear. The reason is that you have 5 countries who have a veto power, and when they are directly involved in a way or the other in any conflict, the Security Council is paralyzed. The Security Council has been paralyzed over Ukraine, but it is not a surprise. Therefore, we will be facing more and more this dilemma. Do we keep the Security Council the way it is? Because we have the big powers, nuclear powers, involved in trying to solve some of the problems of the world? Or do we need to reform it urgently in order to sort of push, encourage the big powers to conform to what we are asking from smaller powers? This is, I think, a dilemma that has been with us since 1945, but is becoming very acute after the invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks, Ghassan. And I know, I believe it's in 2 panels, Jean-Marie, you'll dive a bit deeper into the peacemakers toolkit, including looking more closely at some of the existing dynamics in the council.
Yes, well, this is a question we'll address tomorrow, is whether the deep discord on some geopolitical issues like Ukraine spills over to other activities of the council, whether it can be contained.
And Daojiong, let me come to you to see whether, I guess really the question is, when you look at the response of predominantly the West to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, do you see a double standard?
Not necessarily. Frankly speaking, there's a lot of material interests at stake should the Ukraine territory, or let's say its territorial integrity, be violated. And Russia had its own version of this perception of threat from the westward, NATO members, and NATO members justifiably had their version of threat. So how and why the communication between NATO and Russia in the final days leading up to the actual firing of the first shot. This is the myth that we don't know. I mean, we're too far away from that. And I do believe there is a lot of review work to go back to look at the communications and the effectiveness. After all, we are in the age of satellite images. We're in the age of iPhones, whereby the preparations for action on the forefront were more instantly known. Now, the on the other hand, we do have an interesting situation going on. That is, the United Nations Security Council seems to be getting more democratic. I believe it was yesterday, Russia and China that vetoed a resolution on in relation to North Korea, were asked by the General Assembly to explain their vetoes. So this is a new development, and it can be good, even though this time around it's China that's being asked to explain. In other words, they kind of, should we say, inequality, if not the continuation of prejudice that Ghassan just mentioned, that needs to be put in check, because if this is not, look, you put it in a historical context here in China, where one of the very earlier days of the UN Security Council functioning in relation to voting on wars was to vote on China's role in the Korean War conflict in 1950 to 1953. And China, the PRC, was voted to be the aggressor, and you had authorized the UN force, and China itself complained about the UN being unfair and being biased. So hopefully, whether this is a double standard or not, hopefully collectively we learn that indeed the tough decisions on collective security, we need to go through a more rigorous procedure rather than this, should I say, political convenience-based alliance making of the moment, hopefully. But there's some positive things going on.
And yeah, you refer to the Liechtenstein initiative, which is probably the biggest, in some ways, the biggest check on the use of the veto since it was introduced. Now having the P5 have to explain their use in the General Assembly. And Pekka, I want to quickly come to you on this question as well, because I think Finland, of course, shares one of the longest land borders with Russia. And I wonder, I mean, when we look at the response of Europe to Russia's invasion of Finland, do you see it as disproportionate when we look at the response of the international community to other conflicts and crises around the world?
The invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah,
the
sorry.
invasion of Finland.
Yeah, the invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I also wanted to praise the Liechtenstein initiative, I think, which Mr. Shah raised up, and it's a good progress in the UN. I'm how to say, I'm from the realistic school regarding the renewing of the UN structures, because the fact is, of course, that if UN wouldn't exist now and we would like to create it, it would be impossible, to create an organization where Cuba and Iran and US is sitting at the same table. And the structure that was created after the Second World War was, of course, very unique one. But somebody mentioned double standard and West. We unfortunately have double standards with China, with Russia, with the West, and so forth, because of the different veto powers that exist in the organization. And we have double standards also in the regional organizations, because the regional organizations, whether it's African Union or the OSCE or other regional organizations, they can only play their role if there is a certain unanimity on the place. And we are just facing also in Europe a situation where we cannot actually have effective structures used by OSCE because of this blocking of the decisions. At the same time, of course, I really want to say that the work that UN is doing, for example, in the field now in places like Ukraine, whether it's UNDP or UNICEF or UNHCR or others, is definitely the work that we need. So UN is extremely useful still in the conflicts, even if it cannot use always the Security Council's authority, which of course should be there to avoid the conflicts and avoid the war. Regarding Ukraine, of course, this is a question which I mentioned in the beginning, that should international community had a stronger reaction in the beginning when we looked back to Georgia 2008 or occupation of Crimea 2014. This has been, of course, sometimes the opinion of some commentators that we left everything too late to reaction. And then maybe an interesting dilemma. I was just today in a debate where somebody said that ceasefire or peace is very dangerous now in Ukraine and Russia, because it might lead a situation that one or another side, or in this case, particularly Russia, is using the ceasefire to regroup its forces and make the second intervention. And I think we are in a big dilemma on how to build a peace where you have a security guarantees backing Ukraine and Ukraine's situation in this. And this is a huge challenge either for UN or for the regional security organization and so forth. How you can give security guarantees for a country of 40 million people in this case. And of course, I'm referring also to the previous two Minsk peace agreements, which Russia did not respect or which didn't lead to peace. So we have already in the history two peace agreements that didn't work. And we have actually the promise to Ukraine that when it left its nuclear weapons, it also got international security guarantees. So I could imagine the frustration in Ukraine based on the previous agreements, thinking what kind of agreements we should have in the future. I will leave it here. Thanks.
Thanks, Pekka. Daojiong, let me turn to you, and I want to try and pull us up a bit from the crisis in Ukraine. And the question for you, and I'll come to the other panelists for their thoughts on this as well, but it seems to me that we're witnessing a growing polarization between East and West, between, on one hand, democratic states and those with other governance models, and rising competition for geopolitical influence, including, as you were describing, at the United Nations and in other international fora. How do you see, first off, I guess, do you agree with that statement? And if so, how do you see these dynamics potentially exacerbating insecurity and conflict at the local, national, and regional level over the coming decade?
Well, the notion of the East versus West, and that's dichotomy, I would say it's more an theoretical abstraction. It fits well in introductory level college textbooks to international studies, but there's not much of substance to that. The word has moved on. The good old days, we used to talk about the North and South, East and West. But no matter you like it or not, we cannot redo history, whether you have deglobalization or whatever else you describe it, the word is more connected. That's point one. Point two is that the East versus the West, usually the purportedly supportive notion is, say, a weakened United States measured by populism and manifested in Trumpism and whatnot. And then some seemingly, as if I may, I'm not good. I know this is speaking to an American audience. I respect your president, and as every leader of every country deserves. As President Biden often says, you know, democracy has to triumph over autocracy or whatnot. And then you have that seeming contrast, and you know, things are not quite working in the U.S. and somehow the Chinese growth is unstoppable. But that's, look, how can China grow? It has to import resources. It has to export its products. It cannot grow without at least acquiescence, if not total acceptance, by all parties outside. You know, that's interdependence that works. So in other words, and more, the third point is that China did claim to be the leader of the third world at the UN. Deng Xiaoping's famous speech in 1974 at the UN said China would always be a member of the third world. But today, Chinese leaders don't do that. They don't claim to be representing the East. And at one point of time, Japan sort of claimed to represent the rest of Asia under the G7 framework. And that was resoundingly rejected too. So what I'm really trying to say is that we have to be careful with these seemingly neat dichotomies, East versus West, North versus South, democracy versus autocracy, or good versus bad, evil. And it doesn't really get us very far. And then yes, then how do we explain these conflict, the UN fora, China certainly being one of them, demanding other nations that take aid or receive investments to vote along China on especially on human rights or issues related to Xinjiang or Tibet, or not on Taiwan, of course, as always. How do we explain that? There is a historical pattern to this, but nevertheless, I would think recipients of these kind of diplomatic gestures, if not pressure, they have a lot of choices as well. So the word is outside the so-called East and West, is more at ease with itself. And if anything, being a third party, they are actually in a good negotiation position, as has happened recently in the South Pacific. Now, I want to say two more sentences, then I wrap up. I know it's taking a little long. And China is also entering a stage of low growth, and there's demographic decline. You may soon hear the word the lost decade to describe China, as was used to describe Japan, when its growth momentum, seemingly unstoppable growth momentum, lost itself. So the prospect, does this really mean that China would, quote unquote, strike out? I wouldn't think so. It does not have to do with a particular leader or an ideology. It has a simple fact is that, as I mentioned earlier, how did we manage to grow thus far? We managed to grow because of de facto, very, very solid support from the rest of the world in terms of supply of materials, also in terms of receiving our exports. You don't, rock the boat that far to the extent that you really cut the hand that feeds you. So to answer your question, I would think that the coming decade is going to be more likely to be a continuation of the recent past, which means peace, but a very sort of eerie peace or no war peace. There is always tension, but no war peace. I hope that English makes sense to you. And you have to excuse folks like me. We speak English as a second language that is always struggling. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. I think, your point at the outset that the conception of East versus West is perhaps reductionist. But turning to the other panelists, and Pekka, maybe I'll start with you. I think it's much harder, and as we were speaking earlier about the sort of resurgence of realist politics, it's much harder to dismiss the idea that there is a growing competition between great powers, between China, between Russia, the United States, many of whom have tight systems of alliances, but there are also many other countries throughout the world that don't want to get caught up in this system of alliances. And certainly this is a dynamic that we see at the UN. And yet there are different conceptions of international norms, of the importance of human rights, of democracy, that these great powers are promoting. So Pekka, as you look out over the next decade, what do you foresee as being the likely consequence of the type of great power tensions and rivalry over fundamental norms and competition over resources and things like that Daojiong alluded to?
Thanks. We have had interesting time now in Finland when we tabled the NATO application together with Sweden, and we are not only engaged deeply with Turkey on those discussions, but we have had many American senators and congressmen visiting Finland, and we have had a very deep discussions on security. And of course, there we see a clear division that actually even worse than what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Many Americans think that is happening in China and close by, and the threat towards Taiwan and so forth. And that's an interesting question to us Europeans, because we are maybe not living that conflict so closely as Americans. And I think the question that Dr. Zha mentioned, that will China get rich before it gets old, is a good question, that on the demographic developments and so forth. And we have of course seen now, particularly during the Biden time, United States that is more closely linking again with Europe and recognizing organizations like NATO. If we compare to President Trump time, it was very different. Brussels was not on the Trump's map, and now Brussels is back on the map. And when we see the efforts of European Union supporting Ukraine both economically and militarily, there's a feeling, of course, that somehow there's even a newborn European Union on the solidarity and unity and so forth. This has been, of course, a positive example. And we are looking also more close NATO-EU cooperation in the future. But this is also something, this close to transatlantic ties, which I take very positively. We would need them also when addressing the challenges like Russia's nowadays and futures politics, and maybe the challenges posed by China. But this is, of course, a new division, and I don't want too much quote Foreign Minister Lavrov, but when he mentioned that the relations should warm up a little bit between the West and Russia so that they would be on the level of Cold War. So that was an interesting expression, because of course currently the relations are very freezed relations, and you mentioned earlier Finland, with a country of more than 800 miles common border with Russia. Of course, it's a very important question for us, what will be the relations between Western countries and Russia in the future, and also how to contain possible threats of the future. And that's why, for example, Finland and Sweden applied for the NATO membership after what we saw 24th of February. This is a major change in our policies in Nordic countries. Back to you.
Thanks, Pekka. Ghassan, if I could come to you on the same question.
You mean?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the question is, if we look at competition over rival conceptions of norms, things like human rights, competition over energy, different ideas of forms of governance that we're seeing play out between particularly the United States, China, and Russia, but certainly not only those countries. As we project out a decade into the future, how do you see this playing out in terms of its impact on other conflicts and crises?
And if I may, I mean, at the beginning, Ghassan, you mentioned that interdependence did not prevent war. So in a way, the question is, yes, there was a degree of interdependence with Russia, but it's limited to a few areas. With China, for instance, the interdependence is much more fundamental and structural. So are we going toward an increasingly fragmented and polarized world, or will there remain some kind of a fabric that keeps the world together?
Well, let me take this one to start with. Interdependence. Well, in 1914, the most interdependent economies in Europe were Britain and Germany. And this led to a war between the two countries, while Russia and France had very little economic interdependence, and they were allies in that war. Therefore, there is a problem with the concept at the very beginning. And I believe that the kind of interdependence today between Russia and the US is structurally different from the interdependence between China and the US. To the second question, is there more competition today? Will there be more competition in 10 years from now? My answer is yes, but then another question arises immediately. Competition among who? East versus West? Where does the East start? Where does the West end? Who are the players? What I am trying to say is that there is more tension in the international system, but the identification of the main players in this tension is not easy. There was one country, probably the most powerful one, the United States of America, that has decided many times in the past 10 years to pivot towards China or to consider China, and it keeps being prevented from doing so, either by the Middle East or by Central Europe or by I don't know whom, which means that the most powerful country, let alone the others, cannot really set the agenda in an autonomous way. Things happen and impose themselves on the agenda of everybody. And what I see now is, yes, more competition, more rivalry, less acceptable discourse between great powers. But it is very, very hard to identify the main players in this tension. Is it Russia with a new Cold War between Russia and the West? Is the West really as united as it had been and will remain united as it had been on the Ukrainian issue? And where is China in this Cold War? Is it an ally of Russia or a third country or a non-aligned country? Very difficult to say. And where is India? And where is Indonesia and other countries? What I'm trying to say is that there is a higher level of tension in the system, but I don't think it has structured itself into a new constellation of force, an opposing constellation of force. We may go into this direction, but I don't see it right now. The third is the question of, do we have more conflicts or less to expect? My answer is not different from my two colleagues. And there are fewer conflicts now in the world, despite Ukraine and the horror of Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine. There are fewer interstate conflicts and fewer intrastate conflicts as well. And certainly there are almost no direct conflict among the great powers. My hunch is that this would remain the rule in the years to come, but with a completely different climate. I think that's what Daojiong said when he said it is, but he can correct me, of course, a peace, but with a climate that is not very peaceful. I think this, I would agree with that prediction, that it is not necessary that we will have more military conflicts, but we will have tension. And we will have tension on new themes we don't see right now, necessarily. We'll have tension in the Mediterranean, more and more tension on the illegal immigration towards Europe. It will be a very sort of permanent challenge to keep this issue from deteriorating into real conflict. I don't see a big conflict on energy, on the contrary, because I think that doomsayers about the availability of energy have been proven wrong most of the time, all the time. Humanity has been able to produce new sources of energy, sometimes very polluting, of course, and sometimes not. But I don't see there is going to be a competition on that. But there is going to be competition on norms, certainly. Pollution, protection on the environment, legal and illegal immigration, and possibly transfer of technology. This kind of issues that have been softly dealt with during the happy years of globalization, I think will become much more tense in the years to come, without necessarily leading every time to military conflicts.
Great. Thanks, Ghassan. I think we'll do one more question and then I'll open things up to the audience. But much of the discussion has focused on interstate war, on great power competition. And I wanted to ask all of you for your views on really whether it's fair to say that for most people in the world today, the real security threat is not from tanks rolling across your borders, but from rebel groups and violent extremists, though many of these, of course, do operate across international borders, from corrupt and predatory governments, from coups d'etats, or coups d'etat, competition over natural resources. We've seen growing food insecurity. We're seeing multiplier effects from climate change, and of course, very hard to ignore the role of foreign mercenaries like the Wagner Group and other forms of regional and international interference. So the question quickly is, are we spending too much time focusing on great power conflict and interstate war when, for most people, the threat to their daily lives actually comes from other forms of conflict and crisis? Pekka, maybe I'll start with you. And if you could try and keep your answer short, we'll make sure that we've got plenty of time for our audience to ask questions.
Well, thanks. I think your question is very relevant, and I see actually that this conflict in Ukraine and parallel situations like drought or hot weather in Pakistan, India, and so forth is having a major impact on the food security globally, and it's not only about grain trade from Ukraine, but that's part of it. And when the shortages or prices of the food are increasing, this will immediately affect to these societies and stability of the societies. I think starting from Middle East and North Africa and spreading over also the price of the energy. So I'm looking quite dark days ahead if and when the conflict in Ukraine is continuing, and when it's both the food prices and energy prices in societies, we will see much more unstable situations. And I fully agree with Ghassan that the issue of migration, this will trigger also additional migration and so forth. So it's actually, when we speak about the resilience, of course, Russia has its own resilience based also on what we saw in the 90s with the very dark economic years and so forth. But the resilience of other countries, which this conflict in Ukraine is testing, I think it will be a key issue in 1 or 2 years to come. Back to you.
Thanks, Pekka. Ghassan.
Well, I believe one needs to not only look at the various levels of instability. Tension among great powers is going to remain an issue. I don't expect relations to be very quiet, though in a very different manner, between the US and China and the US and America and then Russia, and certainly between Western Europe and Russia. So one needs to keep looking at that level. First, because it's important in itself, the way you look at other levels, but also because it affects negatively the resolution of conflicts elsewhere. If the Russian-American relations are bad, or the Chinese-American relations are bad, it's even hard to send a representative the United Nations anywhere because they won't agree even on that. And this is not a hypothesis. This is a real anecdote. If they don't agree on having a wheat corridor in Ukraine, this is horrible for countries like mine, Lebanon, or like Egypt, or like other countries who import like 90% of their wheat and do not have the money to pay twice the price of a ton of wheat. Therefore, I don't think that the other sources of conflict are to be sort of forgotten, but one needs to be multi-level in its approach of its insecurity in the international system. We have been too lazy in looking at the relations among great powers, and we are now facing a serious problem on that level. We have probably devoted too much attention to small conflicts with the hidden assumption that only some kind of cultures are still waging wars against each other, but large parts of the world have gone beyond war and have decided that war is not for them. So we need more than ever to be multi-level in our approach. First, because great powers relations are going to be problematic in the years to come, but also because the fact that they are problematic will impact negatively the resolution of lesser conflicts among lesser powers.
Thanks, Ghassan. I think your last point is a very good one, and something that all of you were describing earlier in commenting on the Security Council, where the rising tension at the strategic level between great powers is actually inhibiting the ability to address small wars in other countries. Daojiong, let me come to you for the final comment of this stage of the panel, and picking up on what Ghassan was saying. I mean, to what extent do you see the need for a rebalancing in attention to different forms of violence? And is there a danger of the pendulum shifting too far so that we're now focusing much more on interstate conflict and great power conflict, and a risk of potentially not focusing enough on the small wars and other forms of violence that affect most people around the world?
I don't think the Russia-Ukraine conflict will last forever. I don't have any crystal ball, but my sense is that it's not going to take years and years, and let me leave it there. So the UN, unfortunately, did not really play a prominent role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but nevertheless, I do think, given the fact that many of the members of the UN voted the way they voted, there will be sufficient interest for the international institutions like the UN not to lose focus on the rebel extremist groups, governance problems, and that whatever else the rest of the world. But having said that, I would think the greatest challenge to any country actually is the sense of unfairness within the society. People start to ask, what's my share in whatever dream in my country, right? This relates to economic inequality, political participation, no matter what kind of political system. And earlier, the foreign minister of Finland mentioned that when he received congressmen from the United States, even supposedly over Finland's application to NATO, he heard comments about China. Now, this fascination with China, this hovering China cloud over Brussels and Washington, also has its limits. If you look at at the end of the day, it's the everyday life of people in front of them. But this is going to be my last sentence. The real risk here is not necessarily trade or technology, is the fencing of Chinese investments, the Chinese companies' opportunities or efforts to invest in greenfield projects in other countries, including OECD economies. That, different from how Japan, the trade difficulty with Japan ended in the 1980s. Today you have decoupling, you have basically walling off things Chinese, you have delisting of Chinese companies from New York and other stock exchanges. That would give space for the kind of political engineering that about a darker China would make that kind of, give space for that kind of engineering. That would actually increase the risk of war far more than anything else. I would think that's the sense of inequality within the country, and then the attribution of that inequality to a foreign source on top of that. When it comes to China, you don't have a chance for Chinese companies like their predecessors, Japanese predecessors did in the 80s, to demonstrate that they can be part of the job creation. They can be part of enlargement of tax base of a Western economy. That's more, that three factor is dangerous.
All right, we're going to open up the floor and invite those of you sitting in the room to ask questions. I'd ask, maybe what we'll do is group 2 or 3 questions, and I'd ask if you have one to raise your hand and please introduce yourself to our panelists. And we'll start over here.
Hello? Yes, okay. My name is Isis Gonzalez from the Permanent Mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the UN. Thank you to the distinguished panelists and moderators for the presentations, for the discussion this morning. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask 2 questions. I'll make it quick. We focused a lot on Ukraine. My first question is, would you agree that Russia's claim to have legitimate security concerns, that these security concerns do exist? They're legitimate. I don't know if you would agree with that. And that they must be addressed in order to have a lasting solution to this conflict. And that right now, are we putting enough attention on this issue? That's one. And I mean, I will give a caveat here. Of course, I'm not suggesting that these security concerns, even taken at their highest, can justify the actions that have been taken in Ukraine. But I pose the question nonetheless. And the second, in relation to Ukraine again, one aspect of a 21st century conflict is that the conflicts are protracted. And are we going to see perhaps Russian aggression stop in the near future, but that a conflict in Ukraine continues? Are we looking at this, you know, the country is flooded with weapons, development gains have been significantly rolled back, and we know that the combination of poverty, guns, and political disagreements, it's a recipe for disaster. You know, I think about Haiti, and the comment of one senior diplomat I heard once said that Haiti is no longer a threat, or is not a threat to international peace and security. It's a threat to itself. And I would add perhaps a threat to its neighbors in some ways. So are we looking at a future for Ukraine that is similarly protracted?
Thanks. Other questions, please. Michael here.
Morning, Martin Willis from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the United Nations. Thanks for this exciting morning panel. I have 2 questions. One that zooms out from the Ukraine conflict. We talked a lot about what are the themes that drive the international community away from each other. I'm wondering whether you can point out any thematic issues and areas you feel that could actually nurture consensus and bring the world together. It's certainly not climate change, as we have seen, unfortunately, but I wonder from your perspective, what are the issues that actually can bring the international community and whatever's left of it back together? That's my first question. Second question is about the framing you had throughout the morning, which was about the big powers, and it sounds a bit mechanic, because I feel at the same time we see a lot of conversation about psychology, the broken soul of Mr. Putin, the hurt feelings, the emotional aspects of that. And this is also where rational politics and a more realist approach kind of collide. So I wonder what's your thinking on that, whether we're actually entering a moment in international relations where we have to watch out more carefully to the psychological state of political leaders. And my question is what to do about it. Thank you.
Great. We'll take one more in the back and then turn to the panel.
Thank you so much. My name is Tapi Pyysala. I'm with the Finnish mission here in New York. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I have two questions as well, as that seems to be the habit this morning. First of all, we were talking about interdependence and interconnectivity, globalization that did not prevent war in the case of Ukraine. But I wonder, does it also sort of hinder actions against the aggressor in this case? Because it seems that a lot of countries that have close ties to Russia will not take principled action against it. And what could be done about that as well? And the other thing is sort of one shared factor among Russia and other conflicts in the world seems to be the lack of democratic institutions and sort of authoritarianism, which is on the rise. I wonder if you have any comments on that and also how to sort of prevent that. Thank you.
Great. So quite a feast of questions. We'll turn back to the panel. If you need me to restate any of those, I'm happy to. I think I've captured them all, and don't feel obligated to respond to all of them. Maybe pick and choose a few, but I'll come back in the order of speakers. Pekka, starting with you, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the good variety of questions. And maybe to the first question, if Russia has legitimate security concerns, well, yes, of course, every country has the border has to be respected and no threats over the border and so forth. This is a little bit sensitive to ask us Finns because autumn 1939, Russia attacked Finland in the Winter War, saying that they have legitimate security interest against Finland, and that was our part of the Second World War, so we can discuss on those security interests. We have mechanisms like OSCE and others to address those issues, but at the same time there are agreements on sovereignty and respecting the borders and so forth. So that has to take into consideration. How this will continue, difficult to say, but of course earlier we probably saw quite divided Ukraine also with the language lines, Russian and Ukrainian language, and now we see a unified Ukraine, including the Russian-speaking areas, and of course the memory of the war or the attack will remain 100 to 200 years. That's experience in Europe. It will be generation, so it will be remaining for a long time. Then to the second question on are there some thematic positive issues? Climate change was mentioned, energy cooperation, fighting against poverty, fighting for the human rights altogether. These I see unifying elements globally that could be used. On the big powers and this emotions, when we look back 100 years to our neighbor Russia, it was first Tsar time Russia, then it was Lenin, Stalin, then came Khrushchev, then came Brezhnev. After him came Gorbachev, Yeltsin, then came Putin. And when we look 100 years in front of us, that's our best guess. What we have seen in the past will continue in the future. Sometimes Western oriented and more democratic, liberal, sometimes more authoritarian. And as a neighbor, you have at least to be prepared for that kind of developments. And finally on issues of the democratic institutions, I just want to mention that we have in Russia, of course, several organizations working for environment, working for human rights, and so forth. Unfortunately, many of them are now listed under the list of the enemies of state and so forth. But we saw, of course, since 80s and 90s, a very lively non-governmental community that still exists in Russia, and that's a very positive issue. Back to you.
Thanks, Pekka. Ghassan, please.
Well, about legitimate concerns, Russia's legitimate concerns, I am ready to take any country that expresses legitimate concerns for its security. I think we should listen to anybody who has legitimate concerns to express. So I don't rule out the idea of legitimate concerns. However, to have a legitimate concern does not mean that you can legitimize neither your objective nor your instrument. So you cannot, because you have legitimate concerns, decide to go and snatch a part of another country or operate a regime change in another country or whatever. And because you have a legitimate concern about your security, it doesn't mean it legitimizes your recourse to military action as a remedy to these concerns. That is why let us clearly identify legitimate concerns on the one hand, legitimate objectives on the second hand, and legitimate means on the third hand. And these are very different. And one of the problems is that many people sort of mix the three together, because either with legitimate concerns, you may have illegitimate objectives and you may use illegitimate means to reach them. Second, on the question that has been asked about democracy, this is an important issue. This is an important issue. I think we have reached the democratic apex in the world around 2005, 2006, where for the first time in history, more than half of the human beings and countries have been living under a democratic regime. But since then, the trend has been more repressive, less optimistic, in different ways. One way is coup d'etat, as we had in Myanmar, in Thailand, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea, in different places. Not Cote d'Ivoire, but in Guinea. But also through the qualitative decline of democracy in some recently democratized countries, and Russia, Turkey, and other countries are part of this category. But there is a problem with democracy in the old democracies as well. Yesterday, you had elections in France where, for the first time, legislative elections, less than 50% of the population participated in the vote, because the others did not. And whatever you had on a certain day of January, a year and a half ago in the United States is not very promising for the future of democracy. So we have a sort of democratic contraction in the past 15 years. And it needs to be addressed not only by those who are living under military rule, but also by those who are living under illiberal electoral rules, and also in all democracies as well. Finally, about personal politics I would like to say, we have seen the movie already. Remember the time where we called Saddam Hussein Hitler? Remember the time when we called Gaddafi Hitler? Remember the time where we called Putin Hitler? It's easy to personalize. We have seen this movie already. And I think it's a habit in international relations. When you are unhappy, and sometimes, and this is the case this time, legitimately unhappy with the politics of a country, to try and concentrate your blame on the leader so that you may have allies in the general population of his country. This is an old trick, but this does not mean that whatever we hear about the ultra-personalization of decision-making is real or is always real. I don't want to exclude the fact that it could be in that case that Mr. Putin persona played an important role in decision-making. I don't rule it out. But I would like to warn you against the old trick of over-personalizing decision-making in countries where you are not happy with the decisions that were made.
Thank you, Ghassan. Daojiong.
I'm going to be a little philosophical here. Legitimacy. There are competing definitions of legitimacy. And here in Asia, between China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, whatnot, we have layers and multiple webs of definitions of legitimacy. And then for better or for worse, we speak to each other. The lingua franca is English, and we are all influenced by some level of the theories we read in English language textbooks or by going to schools abroad. So what I'm really trying to say is that we have to accept some level of confusion rather than clarity. What worries me about the talk of legitimacy is a refusal to listen to the other side, is a refusal to take another version of interpretation, or the refusal to go somewhere deeper into history, and of course the refusal to look at what's being discussed away from the diplomatic channels within countries, within their own societies. Academic exchange and forums like these are critically important. But now we cannot stay, in terms of politics, foreign policy, we cannot keep being philosophical. But what's really difficult now, I think this is probably the discussions such forums or the UN should nurture, is that all countries, or as many as possible, when we talk about legitimacy of actions, of aspirations, can we agree on some sort of cut-off time for redressing old wounds, right? This is the point, probably the United States leadership is not really that strong, right? When they talk about the rules-based international order, yeah, it's a nice idea. We don't, philosophically, it's very strong. But if that's so, rules have long histories. And a lot of times the same phrase can be used to legitimize revisionist in the historical sense, okay, not necessarily in a democracy versus non-democracy sense. But can we agree on to delegitimize someone else? With their numerous examples, can we agree on the cutoff of World War II? That the end of World War II at the cutoff time, say grievances before that are not going to revisit it in terms of territories, in terms of boundary lines, right? Or can we agree on the creation of the United Nations as the date? Because if you look at what's going on in Russia, right? We hear, I read this through translation, Mr. Putin talk about the Tsarist days, talk about the good old days as a way of legitimizing. And that voice has appeal in that domestic situation, as Ghassan said, we may be tempted to think that with one particular individual leader out of the stage, but no, that sentiment is going to stay, whoever is the leader of that state. So then that's one point. So can we somehow nurture the discussion to say, what, wait, we all have differences, but let's have a cut-off time in terms of history of grievances, and to give it some more substance to this so big idea of, I'm not laughing at it, okay? It's a serious idea, rules-based international order, right? In terms of what do we mean, when the beginning of that rule. And secondly, the third question that came up was that, have we learned some lesson for getting together in addition to climate change? I think one lesson that as many governments or as many serious citizens of diplomacy should learn is that we have to be really careful with the idea of identity, ethnicity, or religion or whatnot. We need to move beyond one person or one government. We have to go back to the argument that says, this is a historical wound. And Kosovo, frankly speaking, was a good example of this ethnicity being the justification or being the legitimacy for treating each other within that old boundary called Yugoslavia, right? And similarly today, whether you handle domestic grievances or you try to care about changes in another society, maybe the starting point is human rights, but then there are ethnic issues, there are religious issues. We have to be very careful about saying, oh, fine, these identity politics, especially those that are based on religion or other forms of, should we say, imaginative, that drives a lot of imagination. A lot of times, outsiders, outside meaning in the sense of geography, okay, in the sense of knowledge taking, not necessarily in terms of legitimacy of diplomatic action. Outsiders fall victim to the language, to the image engineering when we try to understand, we try to respond, we respond to the pride, let's say, not pride, I'm sorry, to the plight of certain groups in certain localities around the world. I hope this makes sense, but let me stop here.
Thanks, Daojiong. Listening to you, I mean, it strikes me one dimension of a lot of conflict in politics in general that we're seeing today that we haven't really touched on, but I think is worth putting on the table is, of course, the impact of digital technology, of social media, the heightened ability of states and non-state actors to shape public opinion through sort of alternate versions of facts, alternate uses of facts to create narratives. And we're certainly seeing that play out in Ukraine, but we're seeing it play out in domestic politics in the United States and other places around the world. We've got 9 minutes left until the end of the panel. I think that's maybe enough to squeeze in 1 or 2 questions if both our questioners and our respondents are quick. So I've got, let's see, why don't we take Salamé and then Tina.
Thank you. Hello, there you go. Thank you, Jake. And I'm Sammy from the German mission to the UN. Thank you for giving me the floor, and thank you very much to all of you for this very, very interesting first course here today. I was wondering, back to partly Ukraine and the Russian invasion, but rather on focusing on other regions and the role Russia has played there. In Syria, in Libya, in Mali, in CAR. I was wondering whether, because we had dichotomy, which isn't really one, I believe, between the big conflict that we're all focusing on and the other conflicts that we say are more localized or regionalized, but unfortunately often with the influence, not just of Russia, but of many of the big players in the world in fueling these conflicts. I was wondering whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic about the outcome of this ongoing big war, let me just call it like that, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, on these conflicts in Mali, in CAR, in Libya. Do we think that some of these powers, including Russia, of course, that have been very active in them and have been somehow in their self-interest fueling them, will ultimately end up having less influence and being less active in those areas of the world, and hence maybe allow us to find all the solutions that we're looking at and solving those countries via the UN in particular? Or do you think it's quite the opposite? We're looking at stronger polarization and many different countries discovering that in this game of power and influence, especially also in view of the active attempt to influence other countries and shape their views on who's right and who's wrong, that we're going to be, it'll lead to even more regional instability in those areas where we've already seen for many years different actors, regional and world actors, playing such destabilizing roles. I hope I was clear, Spit.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I mean, I think to quickly summarize, I think the question is, does the current big war, as you put it, actually create an opening for potentially resolving crises in other places, or is it likely to exacerbate them? Tina, please. Tap it again.
So this one works. Okay, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Tina Sotoli. I'm at the EU delegation to the UN in the Sustainable Development Team, Finnish national as well. So the war in Ukraine is definitely on my mind, as Pekka has said. I have, in the interest of time, I'll summarize the two questions that I had into one, and they have kind of been touched upon by the various speakers. And they're in relation to spillover effects from the war and also on the role of disinformation. So the first question on both is that, do you think that the spillover effects in terms of economic consequences on other parts of the world, and subsequently probably an increase in conflicts due to the economic turmoil that they may cause, do you think this is unique? Do you think this is something that is a sign of the times, or something that is new and kind of the result of globalization, or whatever it is, but is it something that we haven't seen that much before? And on that point, I would like to say I think the UN has been quick on its feet in terms of analyzing these effects, and has this global crisis response group already working on that. But in terms of my second point on disinformation, the same question: do you think this is kind of a new era of disinformation in terms of warfare? Do you think it's unique to this situation, or do you think we will see the same elsewhere? And then a more operational question: what do you think the UN can do to address the issue of disinformation? Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we'll come back to the panel for final responses, and I'd ask you to try and be short and pithy. We'll go in the reverse order we started. So Daojiong, let me start with you, if I could.
I understand the lady is from the EU delegation, and her portfolio is on sustainable development. But to answer a question, I would think the spillover effect go way beyond pressure on food and energy supply for the moment. This is the first time when the EU is exercising its economic power, quote unquote, weaponizing access to the banks, to the markets. And you hear the president of the European Central Bank talking at Davos, simply saying, this is a new source of power they've discovered, with or without another war of this kind of dimension. EU better make more greater use of that. So this is very new, and it's going to have an amplifying effect. Hopefully not that strongly, but that's the weaponization of economic relationship among countries, among economies. That's it certainly gets an affirmation. Now, with regard to what the UN can do much about the disinformation, there's a lot the UN can do. I think especially the specialized agencies. Like I said earlier on, you have the language barriers, you have lost in translation factors, and UN is in a unique position because it comes with credibility simply by virtue of having a diversified multilateral staff rather than, you know, this sort of parachuting when you have a bilateral visits on a bilateral basis, or when I always think the UN should try harder in that sense. It may not be the authentic version, but the UN can come in and say, look, on this information, there's according to the UN tablet, to the extent the UN can collect and summarize, there are these different versions on the table. Let's step back before we and analyze them and think through before we just adopt one particular version. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Ghassan.
I'm sorry, I haven't heard really the second person, so I can't answer his or her question. But for the first one, I have a very clear answer. My friend, there is no civil war I know of in the world today or in the recent past with no foreign interference in it. I can cite in the Libyan case at least 7 countries directly interfering with Libyan affairs. I'm not sure they fueled the conflict all the time. More often than not, they are pressed or invited by local players into interfering. Sometimes they do it on their own volition or for some unlawful purpose. But there are no civil wars that are confined nowadays to national boundaries. All civil wars, no. In fact, I was looking for a book on the Taiping Chinese Civil War in the middle of the 19th century, hoping to find a civil war with no foreign interference. Surprise, surprise, there was a lot of foreign interference already in that war. So nowadays, it's very common. In fact, a civil war is to be redefined as a war among local players with a high level of foreign interference in it, rather than the classical definition of a civil war as a war that takes place within the boundaries of a state.
Pekka, let me turn to you for the final word of the panel.
Thanks, and thanks for good questions, and thanks for possibility to participate. First, was it Sami who asked the questions about are we in more divided world on Cold War type of concept is prevailing, and that's true that if you are not on our side, you are on the side of the enemy. Thinking is now spreading to different conflicts, but I see some light in the end of the tunnel. I see the truth in Yemen and what the international community could do on tanker Safer at the moment. I see the Armenia-Azerbaijan dialogue ongoing. European Union has been part of that facilitation. I see also the interesting EU applications of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. I know that it's a long way, but actually this issue is now how to make a closer relations to European Union by these 3 countries. It's an interesting question. Then to Tina's 2 questions, actually, first on disinformation, I think this is an information war as well, and probably we are more aware of the disinformation. Younger generation maybe is already in school learning how to tackle the disinformation, but not each and everyone. And then on economic consequences, I think the work that is done also by Secretary General Guterres on the grain trade and so forth is very remarkable at the moment to avoid the bigger catastrophe that is in front of us if we are not doing anything on energy prices, food shortage issue, which is a global phenomenon now, partly triggered by conflict in Ukraine. So I can see a very important role for the UN also in this context. Thank you, and back to you.
Thanks so much, Pekka. And I want to invite everybody to thank our panelists for joining us today. They've been incredibly generous with their time, some at fairly difficult time zones, Daojiong, but it was an excellent discussion, so thanks very much.